So welcome, good evening. I want to first thank you all out for coming in the cold because it's chilly outside, right? My name is Anthony Pruitt, and I am the co-interim director for Student Life and Multicultural Affairs, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the UTM Civil Rights Conference. On behalf of myself and my co-chairs, Dr. Lindsay Anderson and Henrietta Giles, we want to welcome you all again to the 22nd Annual Civil Rights Conference. This year's theme is Suppression of the Soul, Examining Restrictions of Freedom. So one of the things that we wanted to be very intentional in doing were providing and telling stories and bringing in experts to talk about things that oftentimes are not talked about or kind of erased from history. I got an opportunity to watch, I believe it was last year or last semester, a documentary entitled Dreamland. And Dreamland focused on the Tulsa Race Massacre. And of course, I'm a nerd, so I'll watch every bit of a good documentary. But I was able to see a gentleman in the documentary, and of course, curiosity got to me, and I said, let me reach out to see if we can get him on campus to tell not only about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but also talk about, what that mentality and everything was like for blacks to form their own communities and start or have that entrepreneurial spirit. So I am going to start by introducing our speaker, and then we're going to get this program rolling. So Hannibal B. Johnson, a Harvard Law graduate, is an author, attorney, and consultant specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, human relations, leadership, and nonprofit leadership and management. He has taught at the University of Tulsa College of Law, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Oklahoma. Johnson serves on the federal 400 Years of African American History Commission. He chaired the Education Committee for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission and served as local curator of its world-class history center, Greenwood Rising. His books include Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with its Historical Racial Trauma, Chronicle the African American Experience in Oklahoma and its Indelible Impact on American History. Johnson's play, Big Mama Speaks, a Tulsa race riot survivor story, was selected for the 2011 National Black Theater Festival and has been staged in Kalk, Switzerland. He has received numerous honors and awards for his work and community service, including induction into the Tulsa Hall of Fame and the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Mr. Hannibal Johnson. Let's give it up for our speaker. And before he joins us, I want to remind everyone that we'll be having copies of his books for purchase from the university bookstore. They have a table set up, and of course, Mr. Johnson would love to sign your copies.
here. I told you, ain't no room. Mr. Boyhead. Hey, God damn it, OB.
It's gonna be okay, baby, right? You're gonna go and Abby and Lydia. They're gonna get you someplace safe.
How you doing, Trina?
We're gonna be right behind you.
Good evening. That was a scene from the HBO series The Watchmen, and that series incorporated this history, at least part of this history, into this television, made for television production. That is perhaps the best imagining of what it must have been like to be in the maelstrom, in the eye of the storm, as a black person in Tulsa in 1921 when the massacre occurred. The massacre itself was a pivotal moment in American history, in many ways emblematic of the kind of history that was happening all throughout the United States. You know, just prior to this, in 1919, there was a spate of so-called race riots all throughout the United States. James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP called it Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919, because there were these so-called race riots, these racial outbreaks in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, all over. And more than 24 of these so-called race riots in that 1 year alone, 1919. So what happened in Tulsa in 1921 really reflected the kind of racial tumult that existed in the United States during this period. It's important to understand the massacre in Tulsa as one element of a much larger story. So I say that the real story here is the story of the indomitable human spirit. The full arc of the story is about people who envisioned, created, nurtured, resurrected, and sustained a remarkable community. And it wasn't just any community, it was a business and entrepreneurial community that existed almost parallel to the white-dominated economic community in Tulsa, separated by the Frisco tracks. You're familiar with the phrase on the other side of the tracks. Literally, the black community in Tulsa, because of segregation, was on the other side of the Frisco tracks. I want to give you an example of what I mean when I say that the story here is really about the indomitable human spirit. So let me read to you an exchange of letters. These letters were written between two friends, Oliver, a gentleman who lived in Tulsa in 1921 when the massacre occurred, and Curtis, who's his friend who lived in Detroit, who heard about the massacre and wrote to check on Oliver's welfare. So here's the first letter from Curtis to Oliver, followed by the letter in reply to Curtis from Oliver. Dear Oliver, I am, by our local newspaper, fully advised of the whole terrible tragedy there. Now that they have destroyed your homes, wrecked your schools, reduced your business places to ashes, and killed your people, I am sure that you will rapidly give up the town and move north. Enclosed, please find a draft for $40 to purchase your ticket to Detroit. We'll be expecting you, Curtis. And then the reply, Dear Curtis, how kind of you to volunteer your sympathetic assistance. It's just like you to be helpful to others in times of stress like these. True it is, we're facing a terrible situation. It is equally true that they have destroyed our homes, they've wrecked our schools, they've reduced our churches to ashes, and they have murdered our people, Curtis. But they have not touched our spirit. And while I speak only for myself, let it be said that I came here and built my fortune with that spirit. I shall reconstruct it here with that spirit, and I expect to live on and die here with it. Oliver. This, then, the story of Tulsa's historic Greenwood district is fundamentally the tale of the indomitable human spirit. And once again, the massacre in 1921 is an element of that history that really attests to their character, their resilience, and their fortitude. Let's take a couple steps back and talk about what is this thing we call Black Wall Street. The black community historically in Tulsa is called the Greenwood District. And there are a lot of theories as to where that name comes from, but many people say it comes from Greenwood, Mississippi, because that's where some of the originals from the community hailed from. This was a segregated part of Tulsa, north of the Frisco tracks, the black town set adjacent to downtown Tulsa. And because of segregation, these black folks were unable to trade and actually provide their services and provide their wares to the larger community. So they traded with and among themselves, and dollars circulated and recirculated within the confines of the community. The founder of the community is a fellow named O.W. Gurley, a relatively wealthy black man who hailed from Arkansas, came to Oklahoma as Oklahoma opened up through land runs and land lotteries in the late 1800s. He found his way to Tulsa, and in about 1906, started a couple of businesses. He bought land, sold to other African Americans, and businesses began to multiply in the community thereafter. There were people like J.B. Stratford, who built the most grand black-owned hotel in all these United States, called the Stratford Hotel. There was the Williams family, who had the Williams Dreamland Theater, a beautiful movie theater with live performances and reels. They also owned a confectionery, a garage, and a rooming house. There was Simon Berry. Simon Berry had a number of businesses, including a jitney service. People know what a jitney is. Jitney is like a taxi cab. So it's a jitney service. He later had a bus line that was purchased from him by the city of Tulsa. He had a charter plane service because he was a pilot. And so some of his clients included the wealthy oil barons in and around Tulsa. Finally, he owned and operated the Royal Hotel, one of several boutique hotels in Tulsa's Greenwood community. And according to legend, at one point in his life, he was making as much as $500 a day. Imagine making $500 a day in 1920 or 1921. Imagine making $500 a day in 2022. I mean, he was making some cash. Dr. A.C. Jackson was a prominent black surgeon. In fact, how many of you have heard of the Mayo Clinic? The Mayo brothers of the Mayo Clinic called Dr. Jackson in Tulsa the most able Negro surgeon in America. And even though Tulsa was a rigidly segregated city, some of his patients were white. He was just that good that these people who otherwise would abide by the edicts of segregation were willing to let him work on them. In fact, do surgery on them. That's pretty remarkable. Finally, A.J. Smitherman was the editor and publisher of the Tulsa Star. The Tulsa Star was the leading black newspaper. There were a couple of black newspapers in Tulsa, but this was the leading black newspaper. He was also an advocate and an activist for civil and human rights. We have this incredible economic and entrepreneurial activity going on in this segregated community in Tulsa called the Greenwood District, later called Black Wall Street. And Black Wall Street comes from something that Booker T. Washington said when he visited the area. He called it the Negro Wall Street of America, that later just morphed into Black Wall Street. Then we come to the period of the destruction, the massacre in 1921. Before I talk a little bit about that, I'd like to paraphrase something that Dr. Maya Angelou said that I think really frames it quite well, and that is, our history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. Our history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. So it's imperative that we learn the lessons of our history, apply them to the present, and use them as we project into the future a brighter possibility and promise for all. So what caused the massacre in Tulsa? It's actually more complex than you might think. How many of you are familiar with the elevator story that led to the massacre in Tulsa? So I'll tell you the elevator story, but let me first tell you why the elevator story is not the cause of the massacre. So there are a lot of things that come together that caused the massacre in Tulsa in 1921. The first thing is the national context. I've already told you about Red Summer, 1919, more than 24 major so-called race riots all throughout the United States. So the context of racial violence and racial trauma in the United States generally during this period anyway. The other thing that's going on in this period is lynching. How many of you know what lynching is? Normally when I ask that question, people generally say, yes, I know what it is. And they generally say lynching is hanging people. So lynching is something broader than that. Hanging people is a way to lynch people under certain circumstances, but lynching is a form of domestic terrorism. The point of lynching really is not simply to maim or to murder or to brutalize someone. It is to do that and at the same time send a message to the group to which that person belongs about their relative worth, their relative value in society. And so between, say, the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, there were almost 5,000 lynchings in the United States. Most of the lynching victims were black. And so the message from lynching is white supremacy. Right? The message from lynching is, black people, you need to know your place. So that was going on during this period as well, going on largely unchecked. In Tulsa, one of the other dynamics that's important to understand is land lust. What do I mean by land lust? I mean that the parcel of land on which the black community sat was desired by other people, including the railroads and a number of local industrialists. So there were people talking before 1921 about moving the black folks farther north and taking that land and using it for other purposes. That's important. Another factor is, I like to use the psychological term cognitive dissonance. You could just call it jealousy. But I use cognitive dissonance because I think it sets it up pretty nicely. If you live in an environment where white supremacy is the ideology of the day, white people are entitled to privileges and black people are not. And if you live in a community in which black people are rising economically, socially, and politically, as they were in Tulsa, there were black millionaires in Tulsa, then it creates psychic or psychological discord, right? Black people are rising and they're catching up. So something has to be done to preserve what many of the leading whites in the community felt was their birthright, right? To be the dominant force in the community. And you could just call it simply jealousy, if you like. The KKK, Ku Klux Klan, the leading, or one of the leading iconic domestic terrorist organizations, had a foothold in Oklahoma throughout the 1920s, had a presence in Tulsa. You can go out to the library at the University of Tulsa and find the scrolls from the Klan from this period. It's a veritable who's who list of Tulsa society: doctors, lawyers, preachers, teachers, etc. Tulsa bears the dubious distinction of having one of the first female auxiliaries of the Klan and one of the first youth chapters of the Klan. And then finally, the media. We talk about the role of media in society today, as well we should. The media were no less important then. And when we talk about media in 1921, we're talking primarily about print newspapers. And there was one print newspaper in Tulsa called the Tulsa Tribune, a daily afternoon newspaper that published a series of inflammatory, incendiary articles and editorials that really fomented hostility in the white community against the rising black community. So all these things taken together made Tulsa a tinderbox or a powder keg, needing only some sort of igniter, like a match, to set the community alight. That elevator incident that I alluded to earlier was the igniter, was the match, was the catalyst. So let me tell you about the elevator incident. This is an incident that happened between two teenagers on Monday, May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland was a 19-year-old black boy who shined shoes for a living. There are a lot of wealthy oil barons in Tulsa. Shining shoes, getting those tips, make a fairly decent living doing that. Dick Rowland needed to use the restroom and facilities were segregated. He knew that there was a facility available for his use in the downtown Drexel building, a popular building downtown. He walked over to the downtown Drexel building on this day, again, Monday, May 30th, 1921. He boarded the elevator. Elevators back then were manually operated. So a young white girl, Sarah Page, 17 years old, was operating the elevator. Something happened on the elevator. We don't know exactly what happened, but more likely than not, something caused Dick Rowland to trip and to bump into and accidentally grab hold of Sarah Page. Sarah Page overreacted. She began screaming. The elevator landed back in the lobby. Sarah Page was distraught. Dick Rowland, fearful as Sarah continued to scream, ran from the elevator. Sarah Page exited the elevator and was comforted by a clerk from a nearby locally owned store. He was concerned. He called the police. Sarah Page ultimately recanted the original version of the story, which was that she had been assaulted. She essentially took it back. She refused to cooperate with prosecutors. Unfortunately, though, before she recanted the original version of the story, the Tulsa Tribune, that daily afternoon newspaper that I mentioned earlier, got wind of it and published an account of the incident. The account published in the Tulsa Tribune the next day, May 31st, 1921, was entitled "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." And this was a scurrilous, scandalous account of an attempted rape by this white on this white teenage girl by this black teenage boy in a public building, in an elevator, in broad daylight in downtown Tulsa. And this was a widely read newspaper. So when the community got wind of the story, there was outrage. Dick Rowland was arrested by the sheriff, put in jail on the top floor of the courthouse. The sheriff actually stationed somebody on the stairs to keep people from coming up the stairs, and he shut off the elevator. The sheriff was hearing rumors that there was going to be a lynch mob that would come to seize Dick Rowland from the jail. Meanwhile, a large white mob was gathering on the lawn of the courthouse. The white mob numbered ultimately in the thousands. The sheriff was so concerned about Dick Rowland's safety that he called down to the offices of the Tulsa Star, the black newspaper that I mentioned earlier. He knew that there'd be black men gathered there. There were. He told them his concerns, but he said he had protected Dick Rowland. The black men were not satisfied. They were not satisfied because they knew about lynchings generally in the United States, and they knew that there had been a public lynching of a teenage white boy about 9 months prior to this event in Tulsa. If they could lynch this white boy who had been accused but not convicted of a murder, they certainly could lynch Dick Rowland. So a number of black men, several dozen in number, marched down to the courthouse to protect Dick Rowland. Some of these men were World War I veterans. They had weapons. They knew how to use the weapons. They carried the weapons down with them. They were confronted by the larger white mob. Words were exchanged. A white man tried to take a black man's gun. The gun discharged. And in the words of a number of the survivors of the massacre, all hell broke loose after that. The Greenwood community, Black Wall Street, was invaded by this mob, numbering, again, at its peak in the thousands. These men were armed. They broke into sporting goods shops and pawn shops to take weapons. Many of the men in the white mob were deputized by local law enforcement. They prevented the Tulsa Fire Department from putting out the fires that were spreading. Planes flew over the community, according to eyewitnesses, dropping incendiary devices and strafing the community with bullets. So when the dust settled, this began on the evening of May 31st, 1921, and wound down on the afternoon of the next day, June 1st, 1921. The massacre was actually quelled by a unit of the National Guard that was sent in from the capital city, Oklahoma City, which is about 100 miles from Tulsa. When the dust settled, we believe somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. We'll never know exactly how many because of poor record keeping, the possibility of mass graves, the likelihood that many people were injured and left, and so on and so on and so on. Hundreds more people were injured. At least 1,250 structures, homes in the black community were destroyed, as were a number of commercial establishments, businesses, churches, schools, etc. Property damage conservatively estimated at the time would be $1.5 to $2 million. If you convert that to 2022 money, it's certainly well above $20 million. Many black folks spent time in internment centers in the city of Tulsa, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned in World War II. Black folks were rounded up and put in these centers ostensibly for their own protection. But according to survivors, what it did was leave the community largely defenseless. Most of the people that remained in the community were women and children, unarmed, really couldn't defend the community. People came in the mob, looted, burned, etc. That prominent black surgeon that I mentioned earlier, Dr. A.C. Jackson, the most able Negro surgeon in America, according to the Mayo brothers, he was murdered in the massacre. His home on Detroit Avenue, he was accosted by a group of men in the white mob. They asked him to step outside his house. He did with his hands held high, but he was still shot and died. Many people in the black community in Tulsa spent days, weeks, months living in tent cities set up by the Red Cross, which provided relief after the massacre. If you can imagine living in a tent with your family in the dead of winter in Tulsa when it can be 0 degrees, or at the height of summer in Tulsa when it can be 110 degrees. It's pretty amazing. But again, the story here is about the indomitable human spirit. It's about these people who were resilient. It's about these people who said, "We shall not be moved." It's about the people who stayed even after the massacre and rebuilt the community in the face of great odds, in the face of hostility from the Tulsa Tribune, which is that newspaper I mentioned earlier. 3 days after the massacre on June 4th, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune, one of the leading white newspapers, published an editorial entitled, "It Must Not Be Again." It was talking about the rebuilding of the community. And that editorial begins, "Such a district as the old nigger town must never be allowed in Tulsa again. It was a cesspool of iniquity and corruption." They rebuilt even in the face of the city, the leaders of the city, including the mayor and the city commission, calling the incident, the massacre, a Negro uprising, trying to pass a fire ordinance that made it hard to rebuild. They rebuilt in spite of these obstacles and these long odds. And guess what? The peak of the Greenwood community, the peak of Black Wall Street as a business community, actually comes in the early to mid-1940s. So the rebuilding was complete. The rebuilding was well underway. Actually, by 1925, the black community in Tulsa hosted the National Negro Business League. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization. It's essentially the black chamber of commerce that was set up by Booker T. Washington. So that national meeting was held in Tulsa in 1925 as a show of solidarity with the Tulsa community. And again, the business peak of the community, hundreds of businesses, black-owned, operated in the early to mid-1940s. The community then declines, particularly in the 60s and 70s, for a couple of reasons. The most counterintuitive reason for the decline of the community as a business community is integration. Think about that for a minute. I consider myself an integrationist, so I think integration in general is a good thing. But think about why did the Greenwood District exist as a black business community? It existed because it had to, because of segregation. And so now you're saying the barriers are removed and we can spend outside the community. We can ply our trades outside the community. Well, the downside of that is it undermines the financial foundation of the community because dollars are seeping out. If you know anything about economics, there's something called economies of scale. So there are other kinds of businesses that can take advantage of their size. And so if you're a mom and pop type operation like many of the businesses in Greenwood were, it's hard to compete in that new economy. Just as an aside, another way that this whole conundrum about integration rises is if you talk to black folks who were teachers or school administrators when the systems were integrated, I think you'll hear from a lot of them that a lot of these people lost, if they didn't lose their jobs, they lost some of their power and position when things were integrated because it was assumed that the leadership would be largely white. Does that make sense? So when we think about integration, it's a little bit more complicated than we often think. It certainly was a negative factor in terms of the Greenwood community as a business community. And the other factor that harmed the community in the 60s and 70s was urban renewal. And that is the case, I think, in many places across the country. I've talked in various places where in the 60s and 70s, urban renewal was a program that aimed to rid communities of blight, dilapidated properties, and so forth. Well, think about it. So integration's coming along in the 50s and 60s. Some of the businesses in the Greenwood community can't compete. They close their shop, buildings become dilapidated, urban renewal comes along, let's get rid of these blighted businesses. Well, using the power of the state, power of eminent domain, part of Greenwood was bought by the city, and a highway was located right through the heart of the Black Wall Street community. It's still there, Interstate 244. Again, this has happened in other cities around the United States as well. So it's these kind of twin terrors of integration and urban renewal that really caused a decline in the Greenwood community over the last few decades. Well, I would say we're in the midst of a renaissance now, but it's not a renaissance of Black Wall Street as we once knew it, a conglomeration of black-owned and operated businesses. Yes, there are a few black-owned and operated businesses in the Greenwood District, including that's where my office is, but it's experiencing a resurgence as a business community generally. It's an integrated community. It's a community of culture, education, entertainment, religion. A couple of historic churches are there. It's really a dynamic community that's trying to carve out a new iteration of Black Wall Street, a new identity. And one of the things that's the newest kid on the block is Greenwood Rising, the new Black History Center. I was local curator for that history center. And the idea behind the history center is to tell the entire story of the community, to encourage folks from around the country to identify the historical racial trauma that might be in their backyard, and to help them come up with some tools to promote racial reconciliation wherever they may be, right? So that's really the design behind Greenwood Rising. So in this facility, there are 4 galleries, essentially. The Greenwood Spirit, which talks about the national context that led up to the massacre period in 1921, including the history that I've talked with you about. The Greenwood Spirit Gallery also contains the origin stories of the Greenwood District. How did this come about? Who was here? What kinds of businesses were here, etc. The second gallery is the Arc of Oppression, and we subtitled this gallery Systems of Anti-Blackness, because that's specifically what we're talking about. It's not just anti-racism or anti-other, it's anti-blackness specifically that we're talking about in this context. So we talk about 1919, we talk about lynching, we talk about the massacre in this space. Changing Fortunes is the third gallery. We'll talk about the ups and downs of the Greenwood community after the massacre, including peaking in the 40s and then integration of urban renewal in the 60s and the Renaissance currently. And the final gallery is Journey to Reconciliation, where we talk about what it is that we can learn from our history that will help us confront present-day race-based challenges. We're confronted with a lot of challenges today that are different, yet very similar to our past. So we're faced with things like mass incarceration, police-community relations, all these sorts of racial challenges that are rooted in a past that has to do with an ideology that elevates white people, a white supremacist ideology, and therefore diminishes black folks generally. So what does that look like today? How does it manifest itself? What do we do about it? How do we challenge it? So forth. And that's kind of where we are. At this point, I'm going to invite Anthony back. We're going to just sort of talk, and then we'll give you, I think, an opportunity to ask some questions. Is that right, Anthony?
So first up, hello. Great presentation. But I kind of want to start off and take us back to the beginning. We saw that there were over 50 black settlements or towns in Oklahoma. Why Oklahoma? What kind of brought all of these people to that state, specifically Tulsa, but also some of the other towns?
Oklahoma was popular in part because it came into statehood really late. So Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907. Prior to that, it was the Twin Territories. There was Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory. Prior to that, it was only Indian Territory. So let's back up. Let's back way up.
Okay.
How many of you are familiar with Indian removal? So the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, were forcibly removed out of the southeastern United States in the 1830s and 1840s, and they were removed to what is now Oklahoma. It was then Indian Territory. All 5 of these so-called 5 civilized tribes engaged in the practice of chattel slavery and had black slaves. How many of you knew that? All 5 of the tribes. So that's how some black folks initially got to Oklahoma as enslaved persons with the tribes, and there were some free black people living with the tribes as well. In the late 1800s, there was a movement called boosterism, whereby people like E.P. McCabe, who had come to Oklahoma in the land run of 1889, he was a black man from New York originally, but had held high office in Kansas. He came to Oklahoma in 1889, founded the all-black town of Langston, where Langston University is, and he began recruiting black folks from the Deep South to come to Oklahoma. His propaganda suggested that Oklahoma was essentially a Beulah land or a promised land where there was political opportunity, economic opportunity, and abundant land and social opportunity as well. He was successful. A number of black people migrated to Oklahoma for that reason. And so some of the black towns formed around the land allotments that these black folks who were affiliated with the tribes in various ways received after the Civil War. And then some of the black towns formed by people like McCabe, who recruited other black people to come to Oklahoma to sort of populate the territory. And I should also say that when we talk about the Greenwood District in Tulsa, or Black Wall Street, again, we're talking about a part of Tulsa. It was not a separate community, it was not a separate town. It was part of the municipality of Tulsa. Yet it was in many ways an all-black town within a town. It had some of the elements of the towns like Boley. Boley's probably the most prominent of the all-black towns in America, and it's in Oklahoma. So the Greenwood District in Tulsa resembled those towns in that it had some element of self-sufficiency. There was some wealth there. There were opportunities for black leadership, and so forth.
Okay. So following the massacre in 1921, what was the sentiment among the other communities of color in Oklahoma? Was there fear that they would be next? Were any of them next, or, what was that?
So I talk about, in my last book, I talk about historical racial trauma, which I think is a real thing. I think there was fear. I don't think you had to leave town to find the fear. I think there was fear in Tulsa itself. And one of the reasons, in the black community, one of the reasons that this history is largely unknown for so long, it's not just that it was silenced by white authorities and was not part of the curriculum. It's that many black families didn't talk about it either because they were traumatized. And if I talked to a number of the survivors, there were over 100 survivors who were living 20 years ago. And we had a statewide commission. Most of those people were interviewed, and their interviews are archived. But a lot of those survivors said, we didn't really talk about this in my family when I was growing up because, in part, my parents felt like it would have a negative effect on my ability to grow and thrive if I knew about these horrors in the past. So they just didn't talk about it, right? That's part of the trauma response, though. And so that was, I think that was exhibited elsewhere as well, beyond, certainly in Tulsa, but beyond Tulsa as well.
Okay. You talked about, you spoke about the community rebounding, or individuals who stayed to rebuild. But I'm curious, and you kind of just addressed this with the trauma piece, but, mentally, do you think that the citizens in the community were able to recover?
So I think historical racial trauma has a legacy that operates sometimes at an unconscious or subconscious level. So I would argue that we're still suffering from historical racial trauma. I didn't grow up in Tulsa, but I've been there for a long time, and I think it's palpable that there's something going on that has to do with our history. And I think it reflects in part in a distrust among people in the black community generally of white authority figures. And if you look at what happened during the massacre, it's not irrational to be distrustful. If you've got law enforcement in 1921 deputizing a mob that is killing your family and burning down your buildings, then you might have a hard time getting over that. And that transcends generations.
I got you. What are your thoughts about reparations?
It's important that we first define what we mean by reparations. My thing is that most people, when they talk about reparations, they talk about only one kind of reparations. So reparations is a broad term. It means to make amends or to repair damage. There are a number of ways you can do that. Most people get fixated on cash reparations for individuals. That's a form of reparations. It's not the only form, and it's probably the most problematic, most difficult form to actually get. Let's leave that aside. Yeah. I don't ever argue that cash reparations aren't deserved. My thing is, let's not fixate on those, and let's look at some of the things that are more palatable and are more possible, right? So then we could look at targeted economic incentives for the black community, for example, if we're talking about Tulsa. We could look at my thing, which has been curriculum reform, making sure that this history is properly integrated into the curriculum, not set aside for Black History Month, but integrated into the regular curriculum, and not just in history, but in a multidisciplinary way. So that's my priority. Building things like Greenwood Rising, the Black Wall Street History Center, is in some ways a form of reparation. The whole point is to teach people about the history, to give them some tools, and to put them on a path where they're working to make things better going forward. So that's part of reparation. So when we have the discussion, let's have a discussion that involves all the possibilities. So I use the analogy of a quiver with arrows, right? Cash reparations to individuals, that's one of the arrows in the quiver. But there are a lot of other arrows. So let's not ignore those. Let's talk about all those things and see what we can make happen. It may be that we decide cash reparations are important, that they are a priority. We develop definitional systems to determine who gets what. That's going to take a while. Meanwhile, we can be doing other things. We can be reforming the curriculum. We can be building museums and history centers that tell these stories and encourage people to work on these challenges.
So I really like the idea of the curriculum reform and everything, and everything like that. But there's a common sentiment that rehashing or talking about certain elements or aspects of history, especially when it comes to the darker side, causes feelings of guilt. It causes almost an anti-American sentiment and everything like that. Why is it important for us to embrace all aspects of history and not censor them and not tell those stories?
On the outside wall of Greenwood Rising, we have a quote from James Baldwin that says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Right? So our history is not all pretty. If you don't get over it. That's the reality. It's not all pretty. And if you're not uncomfortable with some of our history, then you're not human. You should be uncomfortable with some of our history for a variety of reasons. But it's important that we confront and work through the discomfort to a place where we promote the message that everyone is a person of value, that the thing that we share that's most important is our humanity. It's shared, It's not yours to give to me or mine to give to you. It's something that we share as a birthright. And we, unfortunately, have too long ignored the history, particularly the history of people of color or other marginalized people and groups. And it creates all sorts of psychic trauma for people in those groups, and psychic trauma for the people who consider themselves or arrogate themselves above people in those various groups. Again, the Maya Angelou quote, "Our history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage being a key word, it need not be lived again." Courage is confronting history, warts and all.
You spoke about Greenwood Rising. We had a good conversation coming down. And also, you served as the educational chair of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. Tell us a little bit more about both of these things and what you feel like you really accomplished with them.
We work closely with the state education department, with Tulsa Public Schools, to really infuse this history into the curriculum. Tulsa Public Schools is taking a really leading role. So they have integrated this history into the curriculum for every grade K through 12 in a multidisciplinary way. And that can be a model for communities all over the country, because again, many communities have this historical racial trauma in their communities. We started a summer teachers institute, whereby we bring teachers together and immerse them in this history in an experiential way. And the idea is not just to teach them the substantive history, but also work on pedagogy. How do you teach this history at various grade levels? What works and what doesn't work? What are the best practices? So we've done that for 3 years. We created documentaries and public service announcements, just all sorts of creative ways to make clear that this history is important and it is relevant to not just our present, but to our future as well. And so Greenwood Rising is in some ways a continuation of that philosophy. The idea is that we create a space that is engaging and experiential, where people come and share and learn and think. But in the final gallery, the Journey to Reconciliation, we ask that people commit. We ask that you leave a commitment statement. What is it that you're going to do with your own individual agency, your power, to make a real difference in terms of racial reconciliation in these United States, whether you're from Cincinnati or San Francisco or Tulsa or Martin? Hey.
So thank you, Hannibal. I'm going to take or see if there's any questions in the audience. If there are any, give me a second as these old knees get down these stairs.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a finance major here at UTM. I was wondering, do you think in 2022, economically, are African Americans and white people on the same playing field? Like, is that finally, like, that curve straight, or do you think it's still, there's still a divider there? And if so, what is it?
Well, there's the figure that you probably, if you haven't heard, you will hear it. I hear it pretty much every year, and it doesn't change very much. Comparing black wealth to white wealth, generally speaking, black wealth is 1/10 that of white wealth. And it has a lot to do with intergenerational transfers. So if you look at it from a historical perspective, you look at slavery, which is uncompensated labor. You look at disruptors to wealth, like the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is a great example. There were at least two or three black millionaires in Tulsa who lost everything in the massacre. If they lost everything, that means they can't transfer it to their heirs, to their children, and it can't grow through generations. So there are a lot of those reasons, and then structural reasons, discrimination, racism, so forth, that cause the gap to be what it is, and a gap that is, 400 years in the making. It's not likely to be eradicated over a short period of time.
Any other questions?
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for coming to Martin and talking to us. How disillusioned, how disappointed are you that things seem to almost be going backwards, particularly in regard to education? You're talking about they may not be going backwards in Tulsa, but I think in the South They are going backwards. How disillusioned are you? How do you keep your spirit? How do you keep going forward in a time where, as I said, things seem to be going the wrong way?
There's a quote from Dr. King that I think is apropos of your question, and it's, we must accept infinite disappointments. We must accept finite disappointments, but never lose infinite hope. We must accept finite disappointments, but never lose infinite hope. And that's kind of the way I think about it. You have to be sort of an incrementalist in that the victories that come tend to be small steps. And you're right. Sometimes after those small steps, there's retrenchment. So it feels like one step forward, two steps back. You know, we're doing this little dance. But it's a slog. I mean, it's something that we have to just sort of persevere through. So I get gratification from talking to people who are open-minded and are interested in hearing this stuff and feel like they're learning something that's of value to them. That's gratifying. It's incremental. It's not changing the world overnight, but it's progress. And so I think that the kind of challenges that we face, particularly around race, are not like battles to be won, because the fight never ends. I think these are chronic challenges that we just have to keep chipping away at.
Any other questions?
Hello. I'm the only non-white guy in my friend group, and sometimes I struggle to talk to them about racial issues. They're not racist, they just kind of shut their brain off. With any politics come up, they just kind of shut their brain off and stop listening. Do you have like any advice to maybe talk to maybe more apolitical people about this type of stuff without them immediately just drowning you out?
You said your friends? These are your friends? Your people you hang out with? I mean, if these are presumably if they're your friends, you could start by saying something like, "I feel," or "I'm feeling this." How are you feeling about any particular issue that raises the point that you're trying to make? In other words, I think you have to use your power at some point to surface the issue, because part of their privilege is not having to think about the things that you think about, right? To me, that's part of white privilege, is not having to worry about the things that I have to worry about all the time.
Right. Sometimes if I bring it up, it's kind of like a stop victimizing yourself or something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are they your friends? Well, I think you need to think about how much of, at what level are they in terms of relationship to you? These are certainly they're acquaintances, but I'm not sure I'm keeping friends around me who are diminishing me in any way. I'm trying not to do that, but I'm older than you.
I understand. It's just I grew up in this town. It's like there's not much else around, to be friends with. They're almost kind of the best I can get. As sad as that is.
So one thought I have is that there may be some sort of club or organization on campus that's a DEI-related club or organization that you could recruit a couple of them to join with you. Is there some organization like that where you could sort of bring them in and help them grow in a sort of subtle way through this organization that already, so that the push doesn't come directly from you, it comes from the context of the group to which you have introduced them. Is that something you'd be comfortable doing?
I think so. I'll add on to that too. I think it's often important when you're having the conversations and everything like that. If it's something that's important to you, find an opportunity to maybe invite them to a setting that may not be a social setting with all of them, and just have individual conversations, and maybe that can kind of break the ice, and then it'll kind of permeate to the larger group. Just something to consider. Any other questions? If no other questions, let's give it up again for our speaker, Mr. Hannibal Johnson. I want to remind you all, if you are interested in knowing or learning more about the events for the Civil Rights Conference, you can go to www.utm.edu/civil rights. You'll get a full itinerary of our schedule, our conference schedule. For those events that are virtual, you'll be able to see those events. I want to remind everybody that we do have an exhibit over in the library, and it is the Freedom Summer exhibit. Encourage you all to go there. The exhibit is available now until April 29th, and it's open on the weekdays from 8 o'clock a.m. until 4:30 p.m. Next week, we will be having Farming as a Revolutionary Act of Food Sovereignty. That's going to be a virtual event. You can find that link online. That'll be Monday. Tuesday, we'll have the Night of Dance. Wednesday is a trivia show hosted by UTM Flight Crew. Thursday, we will be inviting our fourth keynote, Tim Wise. And then Friday, want to emphasize, we'll have a free health fair. And there's going to be a lot of different services, including we'll be bringing in UT Health Science Dental Group to do some free screenings. So make sure that you promote the word and get that out there. Also want to remind you all that immediately outside, we have two books, Black Wall Street 100, and then the Images of America, Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, both by our speaker tonight. Feel free to get your copies. Thank you all for coming out. You all have a great night. If you do get a book, Mr. Johnson will